Yo, today we are discussing essentially how to prepare on the other side of separation and divorce financially, right? And how to forecast for the future and to make sure that you are squared away and some of the mistakes that we generally see made, okay? So before we get into, I've kind of given you a brief roadmap of things to expect. I do want to lead with saying this is for educational purposes only. We would be more than happy to represent you. However, we do not want there to be a misunderstanding that this video has somehow formed a attorney-client relationship between our law firm at Shakhan and Wilkerson Law and you. Okay, and so of course, it's always best that you consult with an attorney, that you retain an attorney if you do have legal issues that need to be addressed. That all being said, my name is Genghis Shakhan. I forgot to introduce myself, and I'm the managing attorney here at Shakhan and Wilkerson Law. And I'm here on behalf of myself and my partner, attorney Chelsea Wilkerson. We are a boutique law firm serving Georgia. We specially practice in the areas of divorce, child custody, men's rights, as well as criminal defense. Okay. And so today's topic, right? We have a number of topics. Hopefully, you've looked at some of our other long form content here on YouTube. But today's topic, as I've mentioned already, is going to talk about the other side, what to expect on the other side of separation and divorce, essentially, financially, what that might look like. A lot of times people don't consider that part of the divorce as well as separation. But it's something that you need to absolutely think about. And that's going to be protecting your money, protecting your assets, and your retirement. And all of that is something that you absolutely need to give a lot of attention to before you decide to go ahead and go forward with filing. And so, for many people, what we have found is that usually people begin thinking about their financial future while they are in the throes of the divorce, or sometimes post divorce after that decree has been issued, or after they have decided to maybe part ways, and one person has decided to leave the marital residence and go live somewhere else, right? And they begin to think about the financial realities of what it looks like being in a two income home household, and now moving and being independent of that other party. And instead of basically both incomes coming into one household, you are maintaining two households independently. And so what many times people have not given great thought to can also lead to financial ruin by the time the divorce is finalized. And so we want to make sure that you avoid those mistakes. Okay. So, what we're going to talk a little bit about is really preparing for life post divorce, post separation. And of course, hopefully, if you have considered filing or you're in the process of filing, you will maybe give more thought to everything that we discussed today prior to more, maybe going forward. All right. So the goal, of course, is not to hide assets. That's not what we're here to discuss today. We're here to talk more about understanding your finances and protecting you legally and helping you make informed decisions financially. And you want to prepare, we want to help prepare you for life after divorce. All right. And so let's talk really quickly about why financial preparation matters. And so divorce really has some real consequences, not just the emotional consequences or the affairs of the heart, but this contract essentially being severed is going to financially impact the parties who were basically inside of the contract and subjects of the contract. And so, according to the CDC, about 670,000 people go through divorce on a yearly basis, right? So, you are not alone going through this process, but you want to make certain, unlike perhaps most of those people, that you are prepared for the financial realities of being outside, right? Or being on the other side of the divorce or the separation. All right. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that's going to look like. There's plenty of research that says that, essentially, when those two parties separate, there is going to be a reduction in the household income because, again, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to be maintaining two independent homes, right? Whereas before, you were more cohesive and the money and the resources were being pooled together. And so there is a reality check that you need to absolutely really come face to face with prior to really moving forward with your divorce. And that is going to be after the divorce. What that's going to look like is we're talking about two households being independently maintained. And so housing, because of that, housing oftentimes can be more expensive because one party is paying for that mortgage, one party is paying for that rent. Okay. Insurance might change. Insurance, you basically your retirement assets might be divided. So that might impact, what your trajectory was for retirement. Okay. Maybe you were going to retire or try to retire at 65. Okay. Maybe now that has to be pushed back. Hopefully, it's not going to be pushed back a decade because we'd like for you to enjoy retirement before you kick the bucket, right? But all of that is going to be impacted by a divorce, especially if we are talking about a long-term marriage, right? So child related expenses are also something that needs to be taken into consideration as well during a divorce. Usually, what we see in most cases, the majority of cases, is there's going to be a custodial parent and a non custodial parent. And that non custodial parent is going to pay their pro rata share of the child support obligation to the custodial parent. Okay. And so, because of that, there are going to be expenses that the non-custodial parent perhaps did not anticipate. And of course, the custodial parent is going to perhaps need, child-related care. Maybe it's because of work, or maybe it's because, if someone has a second job, where, the kids might end up in some type of latchkey programs, there might be additional expenses that are incurred because that second guardian is no longer inside the home or residence. Okay. So these are things you want to think about as you are preparing for that divorce or separation. As you can see, these are important things, and these things can absolutely impact the quality of not just your life. If you have minor children, your minor children's lives. And because of what's going on with retirement, as I mentioned and indicated, it can impact whether or not you can retire early, you can retire on time, or you're never going to retire, right? You're going to work until essentially your heart gives out, right? And so all of this stuff is really important to give some thought to as you are really thinking about and considering divorce and separation. So let's talk about step one, right? Just gathering all of those documents, okay? And so again, depending on how long you've been married a very long time, there might be volumes of documents that you need to get access to and make some copies of, right? So you want to collect things like the income records, W-2 statements, pay stubs, 1099s, tax returns, especially maybe you guys file jointly. Sometimes during divorces, these kinds of documents have a tendency to get up and walk away. All right. They become very hard to find once divorce is filed, maybe because one party begins to hoard them, one party is attempting to hide them to frustrate the efforts of the other party. One party is trying to hide assets, right, or move assets. And so, in order to protect yourself, in order to protect your interest, you want to make copies. Notice I'm not saying you need to hide these documents. You want to make copies, right, of these documents, so that of course, your counsel can use some of these documents to ensure that your financial interests are protected. And that's going to go for your bank records, checking accounts, as well as savings accounts or any kind of money market accounts. It's going to go for investment accounts, brokerage accounts, mutual funds. things like stocks and bonds. It's going to go for your retirement accounts, things like 401s, IRAs, pensions, TSPs, as well as deferred compensation. It's also going to go for debt records, okay? Credit cards, department store cards, vehicle loans, personal loans, any type of installment loans. And it's going to go for property documents, things like deeds, mortgage statements, as well as vehicle titles. You want copies of it all, okay? Your counsel is probably going to ask for any kind of documentation that you have to maybe prove that assets that you are saying are a part of the marital estate are actually a part of the marital estate. Prove that debt that you is saying is separate, is not yours, if that's the actual case, right? Maybe your husband decided to buy a Harley Davidson. He decided to take out a personal loan, $50,000. You are arguing that that is separate property, that is a separate debt, and that is not part of the marital estate, and you should not be on the hook for that financial obligation, right? And it sounds like you would be right. However, of course, having access to those documents are going to be super helpful for us if we are your counsel and representing you. All right. All right. So, step two. All right. So, that was step one, collecting of documents. Step number two, you want to know exactly what you own. Okay. So, we're doing an inventory. Okay. We're doing a self audit of the things that we own that are our property. Right. So, many spouses, they know that, hey, there's a house, right? There are some vehicles, right? That's usually when folks come into our office, they'll let us know that those two things are out there, right? I know that there is a home and there's these cars that are sitting in the yard. However, they frequently forget one of the biggest assets in the marital estate is the retirement accounts. Okay, stock options, restricted stock, business. It might be some business stocks, business interest, cryptocurrency, frequent flyer miles, life insurance, cash value. Those things are also part of or can be part of the marital estate, and they're subject to division, right? And so that can lead up to tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, that if they're unaddressed, that you are leaving on the table, and things that you might be entitled to. All right. And so you want to make sure that it's hard for your counsel to negotiate on things that they do not know exist. All right. And so sometimes negotiations are part of a settlement agreement if a settlement agreement is going to be had. But you do want to, kind of give that some thought. And that's one of the reasons why collecting those documents are going to be key. All right. Now, knowing what you owe, step three, is going to be essential as well. And so, what I mean by that is you also want to do a complete debt inventory. Okay. And I know that this is going to be hard and painful for many of us, just to see how much debt we have actually amassed over the years. But some of that debt may be yours, some of it may be separate, but you need to make sure that it is done nonetheless. All right. So, credit cards, personal loans, HELOCs, tax liabilities, okay, medical debt. So sometimes folks find out that their spouse somehow or other got a HELOC, right, or got a reverse mortgage, okay. So there are things that might be done that were under the table, but all of that is going to come out when those documents are reviewed. All right, so it's important that you focus on debt because many people focus on assets, and so we want to make sure that we are looking at both assets as well as those liabilities. Now, here's a big one, all right? And we just discussed this, I think, in another video. You want to begin making a post divorce budget for yourself, right? So, some folks, this is really challenging because you led a very different lifestyle when it was a two income household, okay? And you may or may not be ready for the reality of it being a one income household and what that how it's going to impact your lifestyle, okay? But you need to, one of the biggest things you need to think about is where you're going to live, how much it is going to cost where you live. Okay. If you have children, you're going to want to think about those schools in the area. That's not anything to do with the budget. It might, if you start thinking about the extracurricular activities they might be involved in at that particular school, or if they're going to be in a parochial school, that might be part of the budget as well. Okay. However, you need to think about a lease or rent, or think about a mortgage, right? If you're in position to essentially get a mortgage, you're going to want to think about childcare costs. If you have very young children, toddlers, okay, and you have to work and they have to go to off to childcare, insurance costs, transportation costs, grocery costs, all of those things you are going to have to give a lot of thought to prior to separation and divorce. And it's essential that you take a look at that, right? So a lot of times people are so caught up in fighting over the house and the cars, they can't really think about what they realistically can afford in terms of a budget post separation and divorce. All right. The other thing, step five, you're going to review those retirement accounts. Remember, I talked to you a little bit about your retirement age. Okay, if you've been married for a couple of decades or more, and that other spouse has a retirement, you might be entitled to half of that. Right, just depends on how long you guys were married, how long that person was on your spouse was on that job. Okay, so if you don't get access to that retirement, what is retirement going to look like for you? And what I mean is, will you be able to retire? Right now, you're probably entitled to. There's a possibility you're entitled to half of those assets. They were funded by the marital estate, but if you don't get access to it, you may, what kind of lifestyle will you be leading, right? Post divorce, right? Will you have to work, essentially until your heart gives out because you can't afford to retire, right? And so these are real questions that you will be grappling with and should grapple with prior to divorce, so that when you are having a conversation with your counsel about what post divorce life should look like, or what you would like for it to look like, this is something that is, you can speak to intelligently, and that is on the table, right? So here is one of the most overlooked things regarding divorce is those 401s, pensions, as well as military retirement, TSP accounts. Okay. And so um, your long-term financial health is important. So it's essential to give this. You want to think both short-term and long-term while you are considering and debating whether you're going to move forward with a separation and a divorce. Okay. Step six is going to be monitoring your credit. Okay. You want to make sure that you're looking at your credit reports as well as your credit score. All right, that's going to be important because we've had cases where spouses have opened up lines of credit in their soon to be ex spouse's name, and they've run up a tab. Okay, and they've done it out of spite. But you want to make sure that you're monitoring your credit, because you're also going to be having to perhaps use your credit in order to get a new place, right? And so if you don't have the credit worthiness, that's going to be a problem. Or if you have to refinance your car to get your spouse's name off of the installment loan, all right? And so again, it's going to come down to credit worthiness. And so I'm going to talk a little bit here shortly about establishing your own financial identity. So credit reports, credit scores, monitoring that. You want to review any joint accounts, any authorized user accounts, as well as any type of unknown debt. All right. And so all of this debt, all of these assets, well, the liabilities you want to be mindful of, you want to monitor as well as your credit. And so step seven is what I just discussed, is establishing your own financial identity. Okay. You want your own separate account. If you guys had everything joint, your own separate checking, your own separate savings, you want your own independent credit cards, right? Or department store cards. If you are an authorized user, you want to begin to establish your own financial identity. That is going to be imperative. Again, if your credit is in the toilet, it's going to be imperative that you do these things to rebuild your credit. Again, it might be essential if you are looking to get a place post separation post divorce. If you are looking to get your lights cut on or any kind of something with utilities, and they are running credit checks on you, okay? Maybe during the marriage, you didn't think a lot about your credit, but now that you are approaching marriage and you are thinking about living independently of your spouse, it's going to be something that you do have to give a lot of thought to. All right. I'm not going to talk too much about business income. Obviously, if you have a business, if it's part of the marital estate, you're going to want to think about the profit loss statements, those tax returns, payroll records, as well as any kind of bank statements. Okay, that's going to be something that you want to think about. Hidden assets is step number nine. I'm not going to jump into that. We have videos here on YouTube about hidden assets. We've written blogs about them. Check those two things out. We do a very deep dive when it comes to identifying hidden assets, as well as red flags regarding hidden assets. Okay. The other thing you want to think about is, again, reviewing your insurance coverage post divorce, things like health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, long term care policies, vehicle insurance. And so you don't want something to happen to you. And then, of course, post divorce, your spouse, your ex spouse is collecting some kind of insurance proceeds because you forgot to change their name off of the insurance policy. Okay. And so all of that is going to be addressed post divorce. All right. It's not something that usually is addressed during divorce. The domestic relations standing order might have something to say about all of that. But your counsel, your attorney will advise you on that. Okay. And then step 11 is just going to be the tax consequences. If you have been filing jointly all of these years, you're going to want to think about, of course, moving forward with maybe a tax professional that just deals with your tax obligations. Okay. And then you want to make sure that you are protected and indemnified from the other party filing for bankruptcy. Okay. Because that can become an issue. You can be dragged into bankruptcy proceedings, or if they get in trouble with the IRS, you can be dragged into that fight as well. So you want to make sure that you are protected, and then your counsel could advise you on that as well. Okay. And then lastly, just we want to avoid making emotional financial decisions. So, for example, say, hey, I want to keep the house at all costs. If it makes financial sense, then yeah, perhaps. If it does not make financial sense, if it's going to lead you into financial ruin, if it's going to be foreclosed on simply because you do not have the resources to maintain the residence, then it's something that you need to speak with your attorney about, right? And you don't want to be fighting over small assets that are, sometimes people will fight just for fighting's sake. You don't want to make sure that if there are fair settlement agreements on the table, you do want to have that conversation with your counsel. You don't want to, kind of push away from the table and, basically be unagreeable when it comes to fair settlement agreements simply because of essentially the frustration or the anger you may feel at your soon to be ex spouse, or at the essentially the marriage being in disarray. Okay. All right. So that is a little bit. We wanted to talk to you this evening about things that you should be thinking about prior to filing for divorce that are going to impact your financial life, financial health, and financial well being before divorce and separation. Many times people don't really give this any serious thought until either A, they have decided to up and leave the house, and they have this aha moment where it's like, oh crap, I have to go get my own place and I need utilities. And I'm gonna have to, pay the rent, and I'm gonna have to get groceries, and gas is $5 a gallon. I don't know how I'm going to get the kids back and forth to school. You want to think and consider all of this stuff. Think about it prior to actually filing for divorce or get separated. You want to have that budget in place. You want to think short term and long term. Again, you want to do the inventory. You want to do the audit. That's going to be essential, right? And then you want to think about, your war chest. And what do I mean by a war chest? It's probably important to hire counsel, right? To bring counsel on, to make certain that your rights are further protected, and the things like assets as well as those liabilities are going to properly be addressed, and that you are going to be well taken care of, into the future. Okay. All right, guys, I thank you for joining us for this video. Please, if this has been helpful, like, share, follow us, turn on your notifications. If we can assist you, you can always give us a call for a consultation if you need counsel, and you are calling around looking for a law firm to retain. 404-999-9529. That was 404-478-845-1213. We have multiple offices. We be very, very willing to help. And we, of course, always appreciate your time and effort.